This is Beyond the Big Screen podcast with your host, Steve Guerra.
I'd like to welcome a very special guest today, Stephen McGinty, author of The Dive, the Untold Story of the World's Deepest Submarine Rescue. Stephen McGinty is an award-winning journalist, author, and producer of documentaries based in Scotland. Thank you so much for coming on Beyond the Big Screen today.
And thank you for inviting me. I'm delighted to talk about this fantastic story. So thank you.
And you spell Stephen the right way, which goes a long way as well.
I always felt it was the cool ones that were truncated to Steve, like Steve McQueen, and I never quite made it. But we can be uncool together.
Yes. Now, this book, The Dive, tells the story of a 1973 accident involving a submersible working on burying undersea telecommunications cable in the unforgiving North Atlantic Ocean. And it's really an unbelievable tale with so many different side stories and larger than life characters. And these are really the types of stories that I love to talk about on Beyond the Big Screen. But to start off, how did you get interested in this story? And how is it that a story this exciting and dramatic and unbelievable was not more widely known?
Well, that's a very good question. I first heard about this story, ironically, on a cruise about 10, 15 years ago. And I was sitting at the captain's table, and he talked about this adventure, effectively, that he'd heard about, and about a small submarine that had sunk off the coast of 150 miles off the coast of Ireland back in 1973. And I'd always been fascinated by the sea. I'd loved Jaws as a kid. I'd always been kind of the Undersea World of Jacques Cousteau was one of my favorite programs. So anything to do with the sea, and particularly submersibles and divers, had always intrigued me. And I filed it away. I was writing a different book at the time. And then a few years ago, I decided to dust it down, effectively, just to have a look and to see what had been written about it in the past. Was there scope to tell the story effectively? And I was very pleased to discover that Roger Chapman, who was one of the survivors, or there was two men on the submarine. We'll come to that in a minute. He'd written a memoir, but it was published back in 1975. And what I really wanted to do was to tell the story, not effectively from the viewpoint, although that was very important, of the men in the submarine, but of this massive rescue operation, this Brotherhood of the Sea, effectively, as I've called it, that came together very quickly and worked under immense pressure to get these men to the surface. And just to kind of fill your listeners in, to try and imagine what this was like, to picture the scene, really, there was a ship called Vickers Voyager, which was a kind of large converted fishing trawler, which was sitting about 150 miles off the coast of Cork. And its job was to be the base for a small Pisces submarine. So Vickers Voyager is sitting on the surface. The Pisces 3 was a small submarine. And the way to imagine the plight that these two men, Roger Mallinson and Roger Chapman, was in is, I've always tried to, when people ask me what the book was about, I said, well, try and imagine that you're in a phone box, and that the phone box is sitting right next to the very bottom of the Empire State Building. And imagine you're looking through the windows of the phone box and you see the Atlantic Ocean roll in and then settle 10 stories above the very tip of the top of the Empire State Building. Then turn out all the lights, then start leaking oxygen. Then imagine that it will be 48 hours before anyone can begin a rescue attempt. And then when they do begin the rescue attempt, everything will go wrong. And that's the position that Roger Mallinson and Roger Chapman found themselves on in August 1973. And really what I wanted to do was create a non-fiction thriller. That was the goal, was to tell the story in a way that the reader would be, despite the fact knowing that I mean, they do get rescued, and we should say we're not giving the game away. There's no spoilers in real life, but it was so incredibly close, and it could have ended so easily in disaster, that there is a great degree of tension every step of the way. from the beginning, when what they were doing effectively was, and this is what's lovely about the story is, we live in an amazing digital age. We're sitting here, I'm in Scotland, you're in America, we're looking at each other through Zoom. Well, this book takes place in 1973, and when they're, the submarine is down there working on the cutting edge of technology, because what they're doing is they're burying the Cantat 2 cable, which was the Canadian transatlantic telephone cable. And this was a fantastic new revolution telecommunications, because what this cable could do was it would allow 1,700 people anywhere in America and Canada to phone the UK at any one time. Now, try and imagine that today, 1,700 people, and this is revolutionary. That 1,700 people can make a transatlantic phone call at any one time, courtesy of this new cable. And what they were doing was they were taking the submarine down to the bottom of the Atlantic. They were finding the cable, and they were burying it because it was still in an area where there was fishing, and it was at a depth 1,700 feet. Where fishing trawlers could go down. And as I said in the book, Murphy's Law still operates 150 miles off the coast of Ireland. And sure enough, it was inevitable that a fishing trawler could pull it up. So what they were doing was digging a little trench, dropping the cable into the trench, and then burying it. Roger Mallinson and Roger Chapman were on their third day of a 2-week stretch doing this job. They went down about 2 a.m. Went down to the bottom, spent 8 hours burying the cable, and then rose back to the surface. They were tired. They'd been kind of working hard, concentrating all those kind of 8 to 10 hours, and they were looking forward to kind of cook breakfast and a shower. What happened though is they got to the top, they got to the surface effectively, and the job of there was a crew on the surface, and their job was to reel in the submarine, because it would get to the surface, and they would attach a tow rope to it. And what was interesting was the way that they knew where the submarine was at any one time was not through sonar or anything technique like that. This is a program dedicated to the true stories behind the movies. So, but what they did then was something like Jaws. Remember in Jaws where they shoot the barrels into the shark? Well, what they would do is they had a large kind of buoyant buoy, and they would attach a rope, a 5,000-foot piece of rope, to the submarine. So they would always know where the submarine was in relation to the buoy on the surface. But when they got to the surface, the first thing the diver did was disconnect that buoy and start pulling in the rope, because the submarine was on the surface and they knew exactly what it was. But a freak accident took place. The rope that was towing the ship in, so it was towing the submarine in, coiled round a bolt that was attached to the kind of aft sphere, which was the back of the submarine. And in a freak accident, the bolt was loosened, and the atmospheric pressure in the aft sphere popped up this hatch, and immediately the Atlantic effectively flooded in to the back of this aft hatch, and suddenly you've got a submarine that's not a sort of negative buoyancy anymore. If it's positive buoyancy, it's weighted, and it immediately sinks. So it sinks down 170 feet, at which point it stops, and it stops because the tow rope, which is attached to the ship and attached to the submarine, has caught. But there's no way that the tow rope can sustain the weight of the submarine. So it's just a matter of time before it snaps. So the first thing they do is Roger Mallinson frantically starts to unscrew a kind of weight that's inside the submarine in an attempt to loosen the weight of the submarine so that it might last, the line might last a bit longer. So he's frantically unwinding the screw to release it. And what happens is, as soon as he releases it, he hears a massive bang, and it's just timing's lousy. He's released the weight, but the rope has snapped, and the submarine's falling, and it's basically falling down, 100 feet, 200 feet, 300 feet, 400 feet, 500 feet, 600 feet. They're looking at the depth gauge as they go down, and they don't know they're falling fast. So they stuff rags in their mouth in case they bite off their tongues on impact. They cushion themselves as much as they can, and then they slam down, onto the to the ocean bed, and everything's dark because they've turned off all the kind of power just in case there's a fire. So they slam down to the bottom, and they're just waiting. Immediately, first thing is, has the integrity of the submarine maintained? Has it cracked? They realize that's not the case, and they realize that they have to turn on the battery powers. And there's a fear that if there's a crack in one of the batteries, one of the cables, it could ignite the oxygen inside. So there's a kind of very fearful moment where they power up. They manage to power up okay, and then they realize the position they're in. They are deeper than any submarine has ever been rescued in history. They don't know where the surface don't know where they are because the buoy's been taken off, and the only vessels that can rescue them are other miniature submarines. One of which is in the North Sea, one of which is on the east coast of Canada, which is working on the other side of the cable, and the other one is in San Diego, and they're the only things that can rescue them. And then the rescue begins.
Well, you've set up so many different angles we can approach. And I thought one thing that I was really fascinated with is the Pisces submersible craft. It's such a complicated piece of equipment, but the way you had laid it out in the book is that it was really, there was all these kind of abortive attempts at submersibles, famous things like the Turtle in New York Harbor, but they really didn't have all of the technology that really came in. But it was really this John Phillips Holland, who it seemed like almost every single component that you can think of that's in a modern submarine was basically, he put all these components together. What was maybe the connection between what made the Pisces special as a submersible, and how does that maybe connect into the evolution of submersible technology?
Well, what was fascinating about Pisces was that it was the first commercial miniature submarine in the 60s. It was created by a guy called Al Trice, and Al Trice is one of the key members of the rescue team. Al Trice, who is still alive, an amazing man in Canada in 92, 93, I think he is. He was one of the great divers in Vancouver. There was a big kind of dive scene in the west coast of Canada, and he was a hard hat diver who did pioneering dives of depths of like 300 feet. Bounce dives, where they're down on the surface, or sorry, on the bottom for a very short period of time because it takes so long to decompress by going back up. And while they were working on an exceptionally dangerous dive or recovery, he realized, well, why is there not a commercial submarine? If we're only down here using our hands for 2 or 3 minutes at a time, what if there was a submarine that could do a commercial job? And at the time, there wasn't. This was the early 60s. There was the bathysphere, which had dropped down to the trench in the South Pacific, 6 miles down, developed by a Frenchman, piloted by the French and the Americans. But that was a scientific stroke record-breaking device. There was the Calypso, which was my great hero as a kid, Jacques Cousteau's submarine, but that wasn't really for commercial diving. So what these guys did was, they realized they wanted to develop their own miniature submarine, and they spent a long time working on it. They were known as the kind of t-shirt boys because there was 3 of them, and they were almost like hobbyists, working out how they could develop this Pisces craft, and they developed it in Vancouver. And then there's a great story where they test it in the Vancouver Sounds, and they decide to test it in an area where, literally when they get there, they discover that the American Navy is doing torpedo tests. So on the same day that they are testing whether this submarine can get down to 1,500 feet, and the American Navy fire a torpedo at the same time when it's sinking down. And I love the idea that the Pisces not only survives that, but it becomes this kind of pioneering craft, and almost as a failure by the US Navy to destroy it at its birth. But what they did was they created a commercial submarine, which was then used for the North Sea, which was obviously pioneering with kind of oil and gas at the time. And Vickers, Vickers was a massive company in Britain for 100 years. It effectively helped win the Second World War by building so many tanks, so many submarines, so many warships. It was one of the great shipbuilders. It went on to build the Polaris nuclear submarines for Britain, and they bought the Pisces craft over so they could use it as part of their Vickers Oceanic, which was their a kind of small commercial arm, which was going to be used by the Navy for recovering submarines and also for doing some work in the North Sea, and on this specific trip, burying the Cantac cable.
Would you say it's fair to say that by like 1973 that the commercial mini submersible, was it still kind of in its infancy?
Yeah, it wasn't its infancy, but it was beginning to sort of take off. The opportunities were there for burying cables for oil and gas, but there was also Curve, which was the American system, which was even more high tech because the Curve was remote controlled. It was effectively a miniature submarine with a video camera on the front, big sort of lights that they could illuminate it, and a controller who was on the surface in a massive kind of like a kind of a steel cube, effectively, where he was kind of operating it from. And they were the pioneers because they were doing it remote controlled.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors. This is a story of huge personalities, and I think anybody who's ever bumped into sea captain type people and like sea people, they're big personalities. Yeah. And I just wonder what kind of guys were Mallinson and Chapman. I mean, we're talking about people who are in a submersible that's kind of still cutting edge technology, going to the bottom of the sea, and they're basically going to work. I mean, what kind of person does that? Because I don't think I'm that type of person.
Yeah. Well, Roger Chapman was a submariner. He was a Royal Navy trained submariner and had served on nuclear submarines for a number of years. Then his eyesight began to fail to the point, not fail, but it dropped below what was acceptable in the Royal Navy, and he decided to move on. So he was then brought on board the Vickers Oceanic submarine team. Roger Mallinson is a fantastic character. Roger is just a great kind of engineer, a great craftsman, fantastic at building things. So one was ex-Navy, one was a kind of an engineer. And who Roger Mallinson can't swim, whereas Chapman was obviously like a submariner. So what was good was they were complementary characters. Mallinson, sadly, Roger Chapman had died before I began writing the book, but Mallinson, who I interviewed extensively, always said that he could not have coped. He could not have, if he had to be in a sunken submarine with anyone, it would have been Roger Chapman. They both got on very well, and they supported each other through this incredible 3.5-day ordeal.
How did they get to, were they friendly before this? It seemed like there might have been like they didn't they weren't maybe unfriendly, but they weren't best friends either.
No, they were colleagues. It's that a place where you work together. You're not automatically friendly with the people you work with. You get on well. You make it work. I think they became very close afterwards. And kept in touch every year after the incident. But no, they got on well. But I mean, Roger Chapman was probably Roger Mallinson found himself worrying a lot more, and Chapman and talking through and trying to work out how they could be rescued. Whereas Chapman realized we can't do anything about this. What we need to do is remain as calm as possible and as quiet as possible. And I think they both tried to kind of work on that. But it's true. I mean, there were big personalities in this. I mean, the man who pioneered the rescue was Peter Messervary. Commander Peter Messervary, who'd won a George Medal for his rescue operation, not rescue operation, but for digging up mines in Singapore during his Royal Navy service, and he was a kind of monocle wearing, kind of swaggering character. And then there was Al Trice, who developed the Pisces, and he was Canadian, but he was in the UK at the time. Because what happened was, and again, this is what makes it such an exciting story. as soon as they realized that they had to rescue these people, they were in a difficult position, because in order to do so, the Vickers Voyager, which was the ship on the surface, had to travel 150 miles back to Cork. And then what they had to do is they had to get to Cork as soon as possible, a submarine from the North Sea, a submarine that was in the east coast of Canada, and Curve, which was the American system, which was in San Diego. And again, it's that idea of the Brotherhood of the Sea. Calls went out immediately and everyone just came to their aid. The Canadian Air Force, when they took the phone call saying, we need a Hercules, they didn't wait for paperwork. They just said, you get the submarine to this air base and we'll have the Hercules plane on the runway, engines running effectively. And that's what they did. So they managed to get the Pisces on a flatbed truck. They drove the truck as soon as they could to the airbase, loaded it up, and it took off. And then within 12 hours, it was flying to Ireland. Curve was the same. The American US Air Force, they've lent them two large Hercules. They packed it all in, and before they knew it, they were flying into Cork. They land in Cork, and Vickers Voyager has to sail back, leave them effectively. Another ship comes to puts a bobbin on the surface, but Vickers Voyager, the mothership, has to leave them, sail 17 hours back to Cork, load up on these submersibles, then sail all the way back. So the accident, they plummeted down at roughly 10 a.m. on the Wednesday, and it wasn't until the early hours of Friday morning, 1 a.m. Friday morning, that the rescue actually began. And there's a great phrase, how do you make God laugh? Tell him your plans. Well, they had their plans and God certainly laughed.
I think that's the probably the most amazing part of the story, is that there were so many different entities, governments, navies. I think the Irish Navy, like you said, the Canadians, the Americans, the British, they all come together, plus several different corporate entities. They all come together knowing that their time, they only have a very limited amount of time. How do you get all these different entities who, it's great that all these resources come together, but they also tying back into the kind of what I thought of theme as all these big personalities trying to get all these people to come together to a plan that probably only has one shot. How did all these different people and groups and entities and administrative units work together to get this thing done in such an amazing time crunch?
Well, it's interesting. So Leonard Redshaw, he was the chairman of Vickers Shipbuilding. He was known as Mr. Polaris. He had been the one of the designers and who ran the shipbuilders who built the Polaris submarine. He had been in Liverpool when a submarine sank during the preparations for the Second World War. And he was aware, and he read the report in it, and everything had gone wrong with the rescue. There wasn't enough people involved. There was elements that had gone wrong. And from the very beginning, he decided that this was a rescue that was going to have built-in obsolescence. His idea, not built-in obsolescence, but the idea that you have 3 or 4 layers. If layer 1 doesn't work, you've got layer 2. If layer 2 doesn't work, you have layer 3. So what he did was, and working with Peter Messervy, was just get everyone on board. So he contacted the Americans, so they brought Curve, and they organised the Canadians, who brought Pisces, and they had their own Pisces craft. So there was these 3 units under the command of Peter Messervy. And the Americans, their attitude was that they were really only there as substitutes. They were on the substitute bench. They were there as backup. And what was interesting also was that there was a national pride involved. Messervy was adamant that the company, Vickers, the nation, Britain, had to rescue their own. Yes, it was great that the Canadians were helping. Yes, it was great that the Americans were helping. But in his heart, he would have felt it was a failure if these men had been rescued, but they were rescued by the Americans or by the Canadians. But in reality, what happened over the course of this 3-day rescue, or 36 hours effectively, because it begins at 1 a.m. on the Friday, in the early hours of Friday morning, and it ends at lunchtime on the Saturday. So over this incredibly tense 36-hour period, all these entities, Canada, Britain, the USA. They're like three strands on a rope that pulls together, and individually, no one could have got them up, but together they get them up. Because what effectively happens is once they've got the submarines on the surface, they do a series of dives. What they want to do is actually very simple. They've developed a hook that they plan to drop into the aft sphere that will open out like an umbrella, and they will just reel it in. They'll just lift it up. So the concept is very simple. The execution is exceedingly hard, because what happens is the first rescue submarine goes down. It's at 2 a.m. on the Friday, and they miscalculate the buoyancy of the rope. So the submarine goes down and it's dragging the rope, the rescue rope, behind it. But the rope is too buoyant. So it gets to about 1,200 feet below the surface. And the buoyancy of the rope is so great at that depth and at that length that it pulls up the resistance against the manipulator arm, and it rips itself off the manipulator arm, buckling the manipulator arm, which the submarine needs in order to drop it into the sphere, and the rope drifts off. So the first rescue is useless. It's told to continue because at the moment they don't know where it is. So the first rescue mission goes down, starts looking around on the bottom to try and find Pisces, because if you imagine it, the Atlantic Ocean is just like, if you took away the water, it would just be like looking out at a kind of a barren desert of sand and sand dunes and rocky outcrops. And try and imagine that you've got miles of acreage there, or miles of space, and you're trying to find a phone box in that space. It's not that easy. So the first submarine goes down and is no longer carrying a rope. It looks around for a spell, then it starts leaking. So it's in danger. So that submarine has to go back up to the surface. That's rescue one. The Canadians are then brought on board. The Canadians go down. They spend 8 hours on the bottom trying to find Pisces 3. So they're down there, but they can't find it. They come back up. They go back down again. They're using sonar, but they're asking Roger Chapman and Roger Mallinson to count words, to count from 1 to 50. That doesn't work. So they ask Roger Mallinson to sing a song and hope that the kind of high pitches might help them detect where it is. And so he's singing this made-up song about please come and rescue us. They need it to be a hit. They need it to ping somewhere. And eventually what happens is it's a combination of Roger Mallinson and Roger Chapman listening to sort of slight differences in the sounds, and the team, Macbeth and MacDonald, in the Canadian submarine. And eventually what happens is they get a register. They know where it is. And there's an amazing moment of kind of hope, like a baptism of hope, when the two men in the submarine, Chapman and Mallinson, are looking out at just blackness because it's so dark down there. And what they see is they suddenly see the water lightening, getting slowly brighter. And that's when they realize that the rescue submersible is coming towards them. They've been bathed in light, bathed in hope, effectively. But that doesn't last long, because what happens is when the Canadians get there, what they have to do is they have a hook, a different device that they've used before, and they want to hook it onto the top of Pisces. And as described in the book, this is effectively like threading a needle while wearing a suit of armor. It's not an easy task. It's a task they've done before, but it's not an easy task. And what they do is they spend a lot of time with the manipulator, with a kind of claw, and they manage to hook it on. And they're fantastic. They now have a rescue line attached to the submarine. But then in this fluke accident, similar to the fluke accident that got them down, that got the Pisces 3 down on the bottom in the first place, no sooner is the hook on the submersible than it just flips, and then falls out, and then the line begins drifting away. And then there's this sequence where the Canadian submarine has to pivot round very quickly, banging Pisces 3, and then chase. When I say chase, It's like elderly pensioners. The rope is drifting away, and the submarine's slowly moving towards it. But if it gets out, if it drifts away, then they'll have to surface. So they manage to catch it, and then they hook it onto the only part that's accessible in Pisces 3, which is the grill surrounding the engines. The problem is that won't sustain the weight. So they have it. They now know exactly where the submarine is, but they don't have a hook line on. They have to surface. So they're in a position where after almost 24 hours, they've got one busted submersible and a line on it, but it's not a line that can hook. The Americans have arrived on the scene, and they're there to save the day. They've got Curve, which is remote controlled, and it's now late on Friday night. And there's this, I mean, what's fabulous about this story, and it's amazing that it's not more well known, is that the boiler suit brigades come in. These are the men who are in Vickers, the Barrow and Furness, which is in the north of England, and they've been listening in to their colleagues who are out on Vickers Voyager, and they realise, one of them in particular, a guy called Ted Carter, is in Barrow and Furness, and he can hear that the men on Vickers Voyager who are attempting this rescue have been toiling through the night. They're exhausted. They're getting despondent. Things are not going well. The submersibles aren't working. And he decides that they need reinforcements. So he speaks to Leonard Redshaw and said, we need to get another team out there to help them. Redshaw agrees. They speak to the Royal Navy, to the RAF. The RAF agree. So they fly in the Vickers small kind of one-engine jet or plane from Barrow and Furness to Cork. They're picked up at Cork by an RAF Sea King helicopter. And again, it's like, I don't really remember, anyone remembers the great movie Hunt for Red October. And it's the sequence where Alec Baldwin is sent out to rendezvous with the American submarine, and they've only got so much fuel. This scene is similar to this, because what happens is the Sea King helicopter is taking this team of 5 men who've never been in a helicopter before. And there's a storm coming in, and the pilot for the RAF helicopter will be commended for his flying, because he has to fly at 150 miles into a storm at night, find Vickers Voyager. And then these men who've never been in a helicopter before have to be lowered down onto the deck of Vickers Voyager in the dark, and there's a wild storm going on, because one of them I interviewed talked about how he looked out the window and all he could see was white, and he thought he was over snow, and it was the white horses of the waves cresting. They have to be lowered down onto the deck. The problem is the waves are going up and down, so as soon as they actually touch down onto the deck, then the ship drops 20 feet into a wave trough, and then they're swinging around. So there's this kind of crazy situation where they have to get 5 of their men down onto the deck in the middle of the night, or not the night, it's 9 to 10 o'clock at night, in the midst of a storm. Ted Carter is one of those men. Ted Carter gets down there and he's met by Peter Messervy, who is not panicking because he's military. He doesn't panic. He's deeply concerned, though. They've probably got less than 12 hours of oxygen left. They've been working on this rescue for 24 hours and they don't have a lift line. They've got one submersible that's malfunctioned. They have another submersible that has problems too. And they've got the Americans who've just arrived on board. But he doesn't want the Americans to rescue them. He wants the Brits to rescue them. He'll accept the Americans rescuing them, but he wants the Brits. So Ted Carter gets on board, and he helps fix one of the Pisces craft. And he and a guy called Des Darcy, who was involved in 2 of the failed attempts to go down. So again, you've got the Canadians who found the submarine, but now it's the Brits who go back down again at 3 or 4 in the morning. And what's interesting is they were supposed to go down. The Americans were supposed to go down. But again, like something from a movie, the Americans are just about to send Curve, which is this automatic remote-controlled miniature submarine. And it's powered by this massive kind of like shipping container worth of batteries. And they're about to power it up. And they flick the switch and it all puffs. It all fuses because they were wiring it up while they're trundling out from Cork. So all the salt water has got into the system. And they're at a time when every minute counts, and they have to say it's going to take 4 hours to rewire the entire system. So the Brits go down, and Ted Carter and Des Darcy manage to get the first line into Pisces, which is great. They have a line that they think can lift it, but they want a second line because it's a big risk. If they go up and it doesn't hold, they're in trouble. So the Americans are finally put into the water about 9 o'clock in the morning. They've got a couple of hours of oxygen left. They don't know they're operating a system, but they don't know exactly how much oxygen they've got left. And the irony is the American mission goes as smooth as silk. They drop it down. They can for the first time they can actually see through the video camera the curve moving closer, drop down onto the Pisces, and they drop the second hook into the aft sphere. And one of the guys the guy who was piloting it, who is an amazing kind of character called Larry Brady, who sadly just died a few weeks ago. I was able to interview him for the book, and he did a big interview with the LA Times about his role in the rescue, which is available kind of online. But Larry piloted that curve, and he described it as easy as parking a car after a very long drive. It went that smoothly. The drive was 3,000 miles and took 3.5 days, but they managed to park the car. The irony is that for Mallinson and Chapman, having endured all this, the stress, the tension, the rescue, the fact they got down there but couldn't find them, finding them, getting a hook on, the hook falls off. The worst part of the whole ordeal was still to come. And this is what people didn't really appreciate, because for them, the worst part of it was the lift. And that surprised a lot of people. And the reason why that was twofold. Psychological. They didn't really appreciate the device that was locked onto the ship. In their head, it was like a hook, and like the way a fish could flip off a hook. That was their fear. And second, during the lift, the way the submarine was pivoted, and also because of the sea was rising and falling and rising and falling, it was like a fish being hooked up. So they were constantly pivoting back, being smashed about inside the submarine. And this went on for 2 hours. It was a long time to be in that level of pain and discomfort. They finally get to 150 feet. Peter Masseri wants another rope put down. And then you've got this amazing character who is, again, one of the Brits. And it's Bob Hanley's one of the divers. And Bob has to swim down with a rope. And if you imagine that you're swimming down, and what you see is that this small craft thrashing back and forth. And he described it as like a bucking bronco. So he had to time his dive to try and land on the top of the submarine. And then while it was pivoting back and forth, he has to get a rope through it and then screw on a massive 12-inch bolt to hold it secure. All the while, the submarine's doing 180 degree turns. And he managed to do it, him and his colleagues. And finally, they get to the surface. And the irony is that both Mallinson and Chapman say that the only real argument they had for the entire time was when they got to the surface. Mallinson was the submarine pilot, so he was the de facto captain. So to his mind, rules of the sea meant he had to be the last out. Chapman was a pragmatist. As Chapman said, you can't swim. So once they managed to get the hatch open, and even that was a massive ordeal, as Mallinson remembers it, and water comes in, at least Chapman would have the ability to swim out. So Mallinson finally agreed, and he's the first one out of the submarine. And what I find deeply moving about it is that these kind of stories, when someone's life is in danger, and individuals are told that you can make a difference, you can help these people, regardless of race, religion, creed, business. Most people have a noble spirit. I would argue everyone's a noble spirit, because everyone in that situation said, what can I do to help? From the guy who designed the hook, from the teams who worked through the night to organize the cranes, to make sure that the cranes were there. These were all links in a chain that managed to get them to the surface. What was very moving was that a lot of the men who were on the Vickers Voyager, they were all lined up, because it was the lift was taken from a different ship, the John Cabot. So they were on the deck looking, and as soon as the white shape of Pisces punched through the surface, a lot of them just began sobbing uncontrollably immediately. It was like kind of emotional vomit almost. They had no control over it. It just happened like that. And I do find that quite moving. It's this concept of people will do everything they can to save two men's lives, and they did it. And what was again quite touching, and what reason why I'm very proud of the book, is that when these operations take place, as soon as the rescue is achieved, as soon as their lives have been saved, all the constituent parts drift away. The ships that are there move about. The curve, the men were taken immediately from the scene. Although the men who helped rescue them, the Americans, were on that ship, they never got a chance to say thanks to them, because they were immediately taken back to their own ship to be checked out. They were there for 2 hours, then they were flown back to Cork. So I was lucky to kind of to speak to a lot of these rescuers, and kind of the plan, that the idea of the book was to give them their due, to bear witness to their struggle, and to all these individuals who were links in a chain that managed to get them to the surface. And I'm very proud of the book, and I would hope that people listening to it should have a chance to should buy it. Of course they should, and should read it. Partly because it's if you read 80 pages a day, you read it in 3.5 days, which would be the length of time these men are down there. And I just think that I do like the idea of bearing witness to what people go through, and also what people go through to save their lives.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors. I had two thoughts that were kind of interrelated. One was that, this is essentially an industrial accident, and there's two people whose lives are on the line. If that sort of thing happened, say, just in the middle of the UK, or in the middle of just, the United States, a couple of construction workers get trapped, the fire department's going to come. Was it sort of the rule of the sea that everybody who could converge was going to converge and help these guys out?
Yeah, it's effectively, in the book I've kind of referred to as the kind of brotherhood of the sea. And I think the concept is, you do not know, if you spend your life at sea, you do not know when you will be that individual. So the rule is, if someone's life's in danger, you have a moral and almost a kind of ethical duty to assist. And that's why, there was so many vessels attempted to. In the end, we only needed so many. But yeah, that's the way it works out there, and thankfully so. That if people are in peril in the sea and you can assist them, then it's your duty to do so.
And was it kind of that same ethos? Like, I kind of pictured in my mind that scene in a movie where you have everybody at the table squabbling, and then finally somebody just like bangs on the table and pulls everybody together. But it seems like with this, they all kind of started pulling together in the same direction really quickly. Was that just that they knew they had to? That's what they had to do?
I think so. Peter Messervy was a naval commander. He'd done these operations before. So his authority wasn't really challenged. Al Trice knew he was coming in as his deputy. And again, there's this strange scene where Al is late. He's he's actually on holiday or on work with his wife in England. But he's late getting to Cork. So he's actually flown out and dropped off again, winched down by helicopter. And I found this great note in the files, and it says, Al Trice dropped on board, brackets, gently, close brackets. But he knew his job was to support Messervy, but also that when it was the Canadians part of the mission, he was in charge of the Canadians. So they handled it quite well. And that's about the Americans. When it was their turn, the Americans, it was almost like a baton being passed.
It's so amazing too, in that in 1973 that they were able to get these people together so quickly. I mean, nowadays something like that happens. You pick up your cell phone, you can be in Kazakhstan and get a call and you're instantly, and it amazed me that with such a short amount of time that they had to play with, that they were able to pull together such a huge, complicated international team.
Yeah, it is quite remarkable. I think it was also that there was days where no one waited for paperwork, no one waited for a sign off. Everyone believed that man's life was on the line, and so the guy who was in charge of the kind of airbase just said, right, let's, on the word of this man who's just phoned us up, we're going to give a Canadian Hercules plane. We're going to trust in it. But again, there was the logistics too. There was a lot of people behind the scenes trying to sort of the logistics, simple things like all the Canadians, none of them had the passports. So that it was someone's job to make sure that the Irish, when they touched down on Irish soil, customs weren't going to delay them by saying, well, where's your passports? You can't come in. And of course, Ireland all pulled together. So again, when it's a race against time and you're trying to shave minutes off, everyone who can do so helped. So anything that was a potential hindrance, they did their best to sweep away.
Kind of in the bigger picture, so there was obviously no 24-hour news cycle. What did people around the world, were they hearing about this, or did they?
Well, yeah, because again, there was radio and television cameras. You never underestimate the enthusiasm of the press to get to a story, even if that story is 150 miles out in the Atlantic. So the press arrived in Cork, and then they hired the kind of Irish fishing boats to take them out. So there was a kind of great BBC journalist who was out there, and he was doing a live broadcast with Terry Wogan, who was a kind of legendary breakfast news presenter, legendary broadcaster in the BBC and in Ireland beforehand. And he was broadcasting live to him, but he suddenly got seasick and told me that he threw up mid-broadcast. So yeah, it was difficult for them too, but they were managing to sort of update it. And then there was the press. It was on the front page of the newspapers for the 3 or 4 days that it took place. So yeah, and it was celebrated back with San Diego and the San Diego Tribune when the American team came back. So it was a big story of its time. And everyone loves good news. I mean, they were known as the Jolly Rogers when they returned.
I doing research for this interview to prepare. I saw that there was something possibly in the works to turning this into a film.
Yes. It's the book's been optioned by Mark Gordon, who was the producer of Saving Private Ryan and Speed, and not Molly Bloom. Sorry, I've forgotten the name of that one. And he's a great film producer. And Beth Patterson, who is a great British producer, is working on it. And Ed Hemmings, who is one of the writers of The Crown, is working on a script at the moment. So, I mean, like everything, we'll see if it gets there. But I mean, there's a great team involved in it at the moment. So my job is just to support them as much as I can and let them get on with it. So yeah, I mean, I'm hopeful, and it's been announced that they're developing it. So we'll have to wait and see.
Without giving away too much insider information, do you have an idea of because it's really to take an informational book, a nonfiction book, and put it into the big screen, you have the two different mediums. Do you have kind of an idea of where you would like to see the focus and kind of the drama?
Well, to be honest with you, I always believe that when someone comes on board and says, right, we want to work with you to make a film of the book, you give them as much support as you can and you let them get on with it. So I've been very kind of clear as to saying I'll help as much as I can, and I kind of work with them and work with them at the moment. But it's very early days, so I can't really kind of go into what all the plans are effectively. Just that there's everyone who's involved in it has a great reputation, and we're all looking forward to seeing where we can take it.
Thank you so much for listening to Beyond the Big Screen podcast. Of course, a huge thanks goes out to Stephen McGinty, author of The Dive, the untold story of the world's deepest submarine rescue. Links to learn more about Stephen McGinty and The Dive can be found at his author's page or in the show notes. If you'd like to help others learn about Beyond the Big Screen, and word of mouth is the best algorithm out there, tell a friend, tell a couple of friends, but we would love your help. Also, leaving those reviews on Apple Podcasts or your podcatcher of choice. They all go a long way in helping more people learn about Beyond the Big Screen. You can follow Beyond the Big Screen on social media by searching for A2Z History Page on Facebook and Twitter. Those are two great places to get in touch with me if you have ideas for shows, future guests, or just want to talk movies. You can also send me an email to my email address, steve@a2zhistorypage.com. I would love to hear from you, and I will see you next time Beyond the Big Screen.